Hello, folks. I'm Endymion for the Dork at Arms, etc. Or if you are listening to this as my instructor or as the TA for my psychological anthropology course, for which this is my midterm assignment, then you may know me as my real name. For the sake of simplicity, we will be going by my pseudonym, as this will be posted on my YouTube channel. So, what exactly is this? This quite simply is an assignment for, as I said, my psychological anthropology course. I originally had the idea of formatting this as a pair of comedy radio hosts and a philosopher historian guest talking about a movie and talking about the guest's book. But unfortunately, with midterms, I do not have the energy to put the necessary work into making that the best version that it can be. So this is going to be fairly straightforward. This will be more like a poetry recitation, which people will be familiar with from my channel. I will attempt to keep this colloquial for the layperson, and of course I will intersperse some academic terms and concepts in order to fulfill my assignment. I will actually be using this also as a way to review a recent film that I watched. So think of this, regular viewers, as sort of a two-in-one, a film review and something akin to a bit of an academic lesson, or at least an introduction to a few concepts. And what concepts are these? Well, we will be examining certain ideas briefly from Sigmund Freud, and we'll be diving into sort of the history of the concepts of the insane as described in Michel Foucault's Madness and Civilization, a History. But we will be doing these in a grounded and relatable fashion through a film, 2017 M. Night Shyamalan's Split, starring the main A-list actor being James McAvoy of X-Men fame as our villain, but we'll get to him in just a second. We start out on the teenage protagonist, a young woman by the name of Casey, who is a bit of a loner, and rather quickly into the film is kidnapped with two of her friends by a mysterious, very meticulously clean man with short cropped hair and all that. The man in question turns out to be Dennis, who is one alter in the dissociative identity disorder system of a man by the name of Kevin. Kevin has 23 personalities in total. Some of them that we see in the film are Barry, who is something of a fashion designer, Hedwig, who is a 9-year-old child, Patricia, who is a very matronly figure, and then of course there is Dennis, who is a meticulous OCD having person. Unfortunately, Dennis uses the identity of Barry, the fashion designer, to pacify their psychiatrist, Dr. Karen Fletcher, who is incredibly compassionate and brilliant. Now, it's revealed fairly quickly that Dennis and Patricia, these alters within the DID system, and I say alters meaning these alternate personalities, this sort of, saying alternative or alter personalities may be somewhat demeaning to actual people with dissociative identity disorder, so we'll attempt to use the more respectful terminology. And quite simply, system is one of those terms, system being a system of personages and personas who are mutually exclusive and distinct, discrete from each other. But it is revealed that two of these alters, two of these identities, Dennis and Patricia, are something of religious fanatics within the system who are previously held back by the others, or banished from the light, as they put it, but have recently come into something of a command. Dennis, it is also revealed, was banished more particularly because of his affinity, as Dr. Fletcher puts it, for viewing young girls dance naked. And this turns the kidnapping into something rather malicious, even more malicious than what you might call a normal kidnapping, if you can call it such a thing. But Casey and her two friends try to escape several times, including crawling through vents and all that, and deceiving the altar of Hedwig, the 9-year-old. Unfortunately, these are all to no avail, and they are one by one separated from each other. Dr. Fletcher, psychiatrist, again, notices that it is probably Dennis who is attempting to imitate Barry, but still can't completely shut out the obsessive compulsions, and thus continuously reorders things around the office. So Dr. Fletcher keeps getting more suspicious of Dennis, eventually discovering late into the film that Dennis has kidnapped these young women. And, of course, that this is for a messianic figure of the beast. And Dr. Fletcher is trying to convince Dennis that the beast that Patricia and Dennis sort of venerate is a fable, an invention, a story. That Patricia's mantra of into the sun you shall know, passion and all that, it's just a fairy tale. But, unfortunately, Dr. Fletcher is proved incorrect. But all the while, interspersed throughout the story, we keep on seeing flashbacks throughout Casey's young years as we see that she is orphaned. Her mother just isn't in the picture, and her father unfortunately dies of a heart attack, and she is sexually abused by his brother, her uncle. At the climax of the film, Dr. Fletcher is killed by the 24th personality that has recently emerged from Kevin, or within Kevin's system, I should say. And the beast kills Dr. Fletcher and two of these girls, revealing the beast to be not only a murderer, but a cannibal. But his entire personality, his charisma, is based around this idea of pain defining you, of creating you, of rebirthing you. You shall not know greatness until you know suffering, all that jazz. But by accident, the beast sees Casey's scars from her abuses, physical abuse added to that sexual abuse, which were previously hidden under a number of shirts. And in doing so, the beast spares her and leaves. The ending of the film leaves us with the implication that Casey will leave her abusive uncle after this experience, and the very explicit message that Patricia, Hedwig, and Dennis are now in charge, following the whims and hungers of the beast. So that is a basic plot summary, but where do Foucault and Freud come out of this? Well, let's begin, I think, with Foucault's The Insane, which is one particular chapter from his book Madness and Civilization. In roughly page 66, he says that evil can only be punished if it is brought to the light. This is a concept, at least, present in the medieval and the Renaissance when it comes to madness, that if you are a sinner, you can only stop sinning, or you can only be redeemed by means of public humiliation. And so the later classical era, he calls it, the early modern era of confining the mad, confining various deviants from the society's norm, is meant to cure the contagion of otherness, and specifically the dirtying of reputation by scandal. And that includes the scandal that may harm family reputation and even faith. And this is a very particularly interesting verbiage, I should say, as the light, as I mentioned, is used in the film by the system, by the members of the system inhabiting Kevin's body. The light means command, it means presence, consciousness. It's the expression, the sort of phenotype, if you will. Now, he also remarks a page later, all those forms of evil that border on unreason must be thrust into secrecy. So in other words, unreason is a natural antithesis to reason, because in defining the latter, you must, by absence at least, or denial, define the former. This is much the same in any ontological system, ontological idea, that any technology or any ideology defines X as this, it must define what X is not, and so on and so forth for Y, Z, etc. But Foucault goes on in saying shame in the presence of the inhuman. This is why the unreason has to be confined. This shame might turn into fear. It might manifest as a spectacle of intimate weakness and follies and lunacy. But whose shame is it? Well, later in the invention of the asylum, as he goes over in a much later chapter in the book, the shame is the internal. It is the self-consciousness of the patient. It is the awareness of, I have done wrong and I'm responsible for my sin. I'm responsible for my wrongdoing. But in this case, it is the shame of families and of church, of society. Society does not want to acknowledge its scandals, so it must be hidden. And I mentioned spectacle, specifically because, as Foucault discusses, people paid fairly cheap money, but came often, at least, or I should specify the bourgeoisie came to visit often, to behold the mad, to go into these confinement hospitals and see these raving lunatics, essentially. They were shown, as he puts it, like curious animals. Now, this is interesting in the context of examining the film, because we as the audience are shown the beast. We are shown the beast as alien, as almost supernatural. He's not there on screen for the vast majority of the movie. It's only in allusions from drawings and then at the climax that we finally see this persona that is at the center of, a sort of pre-in media res, or a inciting incident. It is what moves Patricia and Dennis to action. But the beast is also the pure id. If we go to the sort of simple iceberg model of Freud's psyche model, we see that Freud's model contains the consciousness, and then in the unconsciousness, there is the superego, the ego, and the id. The id is purely selfish. The id is completely and totally all of the urges, the impulses that you face. And on top of that, Foucault goes on to this saying, quote, madness elevated to spectacle, becoming a scandal for the general delight. This is exactly what people were seeing. And it's what we see now with the whole system that inhabits Kevin's body. The reason that so many of these characters, change their body language, because they are real people, and that is at least true to the experience of people with dissociative identity disorder. But it is put on screen and put in this plot of harm, of exploitation, of gendered violence for the entertainment of audiences. We cannot escape this in criticizing the film. And quite frankly, we cannot escape that because it is the nature of thrillers. M. Night Shyamalan's very main genre. It's to feel a fake danger, to simulate the danger. We're actually safe, though, and we know this. We see it on screen, but we are ashamed and scared of what we see. But we are, in fact, safe. So it is remarkably entertaining. There is elation and relief from coming back into reality once we disengage from the screen. But Foucault was dealing with a different historical context in which you were actually seeing real human beings in front of you, not actors playing parts. And so it, quote, offered as a diversion to the good conscience of reason sure of itself, end quote. It was entertainment. It was, if we are, to use Freud's terminology, a detour, and I will get back to this as I go in brief about Freud's death drive, or thanatos. But it is also an act of highlight by contrast, that reason knows itself in defining the other. That, look at that, I'm not so bad. Even if I were flawed, and I am flawed, I'm not so bad as this crazy person. And it's kind of the same in film. We get to see villains who are so cartoonishly bad, or if they are realistically bad, we feel disturbed because it is so uncannily like the reality which we know we face. So there is an emotional and existential distance for Foucault's bourgeoisie, particularly in France. The inhuman in this instance is lesser. The unreason defines what is inhuman. And that is, I think, very central to the very naming of the beast. We'll get back to that quite often, as a matter of fact, as we'll find. On page 69, nice, Foucault notes, and I paraphrase here, that the absence of the insane makes people work and walk around their absence, as it were. They leave a space. So it brings attention and curiosity to those secluded away in asylums. If you hide the unreason for breaches of social assumptions and expectations, you are also codifying it. You are codifying madness, which rather parallels how perhaps DID systems are reduced for film pleasure. If you attempt to portray it, you will naturally reduce it, because there is no film adaptation that could possibly capture all of the nuance of what it is to exist with many different identities. I mean, yeah, that's how representation is. About page 70 in his work is where Foucault really starts to get into the bestial, the animality of madness, that this early modern Western emphasis on reason really gave us. The bestial nature overcome by reason is the ultimate goal. It's the cure, but none of these asylums really had the interest of creating a cure or generating one. Do excuse my roommates, they're out and about. But anyway, but when unreason reigns, the beast comes out. It is the assumption that reason is what separates man from the animals. And of course, Freud's model of the unconscious with superego and ego do the work of managing instincts, of subliminating them, you could say, into more productive works. But what do we do if the chains that we bind the physical bodies of man to, the spectacle of exploiting the mentally ill, and therapy, as is modern psychiatric care, do not tame this bestiality? Do not tame this animality. Forgive me. Well, Foucault notes that it's as if madness is managed to rejoin by a paroxysm of strength, the immediate violence of animality. Quite simply, if it is not put in its place, the animal becomes violent. This is the assumption that Foucault is describing that was present among the bourgeois and most people in this burgeoning capitalist society of the 18th century into the 19th, or perhaps even as early as the 1600s. He discusses that the mad represent a social danger. What does this film give us? What does M. Night Shyamalan give us, if not a message of the insane as violent? Even though we know that this is largely unfounded, that this spectacle, together in the larger film and cinema context, continue to hammer home this message that the insane are violent. But it is, statistically speaking, largely the reverse, that those mentally ill are the victims of violence, disproportionately. Foucault also describes how the mad were seen as having an animal freedom, he puts it. And of course, the beast represents for Kevin what he could never do: cannibalism. What he could never do: be impenetrable, strong, self-assured, in a freedom of wildness. And it is also described how Foucault, and this I think is particularly interesting, Foucault notes how people perceive the mad as being capable of menacing marvels, he says. Strength and wild endurance take on a supernatural or paranatural, if you will, nature, where the perceived limitations are abandoned. And so the full physical potential is unlocked in the figure of the beast in this film, but also in the asylum, in these archaic prisons for the infirm. Well, they're insane. They're animals. Do we give clothes to a dog? No, they can take it. It's a very peculiar dehumanizing rationale, but it is one that was very prevalent, and it is the one that the beast physically manifests, or perhaps reclaims to a certain extent. So Kevin represents the popular return or synthesis between madness as the Renaissance conceived of it, that Foucault describes, that the mad are the other side of the coin to reason, that they're not completely disparate, they're not antitheses, they are the same, or rather, that madness and reason are both paths to wisdom, which is a very interesting concept. But madness is more particularly a wisdom from and of the beyond. It is perhaps, in this case, not just the animal berserker, which we see the beast to be, but it is also sort of a sage-like ecstasy, you could say. But to hammer this home, Foucault notes how people perceive the mad as being inured to hunger, heat, cold, and pain. So, what does the beast do when Dr. Fletcher attempts to stab him? Well, the knife breaks because he believes that he is impenetrable. He believes that he is inured, and thus he is. The omnipotence of thought takes precedent. I am probably misusing that phrase, but that is one of Freud's phrases. And it is more the idea of phenomenon, of perceiving your own will as having some sort of godlike effect in the world. If I wish ill upon someone and then that some ill befalls them, that is the omnipotence of thought, says Freud. But at this time, Foucault says, the insane were not seen as diseased necessarily. So there was no need to actually cure them. And what was necessary was brutal training in order to tame them, not cure them. And he also describes how there is sort of obsession among the bourgeoisie with the imagery of animality. And it is fed, this obsession is fed specifically to continue the desire to confine everyone who's perceived as on the borderline or actively crossing that line into frenzy. And I would also like to point out that this is made all the more explicit, I would say, in the film by the fact that the bunker where Patricia and Dennis and Hedwig have basically come together with the rest of the system to make sort of hideaway, where they all have their area, they have their vlog diaries where they can converse with each other or make diaries and talk to Dr. Fletcher via email. It's in the basement of a zoo. The beast comes out of a train station because Kevin's father died at a train station, presumably. But the other systems and the beast's great deeds, as it were, are conducted in the basement of a zoo where Kevin works. So the perception of animality is very, very explicit. Casey sort of... Actually, I'm going to skip that for just a moment. There are particular lines I would like to focus upon. The sort of anti-nature violence of animality. This is the phrase that Foucault describes, and I would like to use it to bring attention to a few specific points. Dr. Fletcher tells Dennis in one of the sessions before Dennis fully reveals himself, you were not evil. Because people with DID, their alters manifest because they are meant to do a specific purpose. And Dennis later reveals, in just before the climax of the story, that he exists as the obsessive compulsive cleaning and tidying things specifically to ward off the sort of anger and rage of Kevin's mother, for which he was viciously abused. But the alters also note that Kevin, sort of the OG, if you will, the one that by diagnosis, such as Dr. Fletcher's colleagues, would be recognized as real and the others dismissed as delusions, they say he's very weak. And compare that then to the alter of the beast, who is remarkably strong, is able to bend locks, who is able to crawl on the ceiling, bend the steel bars of a cage. All of this brings to the fore that the beast is the id. It is the taboo-breaking, frenzied, super strong animal. Quote, madness thus became the ultimate form, the final degree of God in man's image, before the fulfillment and deliverance of the cross. This is where the beyond from the Renaissance comes back. The medieval and Renaissance perception of madness was that of something divine. It was related to divine inspiration. But now, in the age of the Enlightenment and the post-Enlightenment, reason replaces God, and anything that deviates from reason, which becomes unreason or nonsense, must be put down. Deviance replaced, confined, ignored, or exploited. And I do want to come specifically to a few notes in Foucault's Birth of the Asylum, later from the book Madness and Civilization. About page 243, he says that religion was a benefit to actually cure patients intermingling in religion, because religion is a natural form of social control, according to Foucault. But among patients, you are among peers. And so you see, by contrast, how you should act among the moral and the well-behaved. And religion becomes the binding force through which you can be further controlled. And particularly common shared religious natures demonstrate shared values, those being rationality, productivity, compassion, calmness, even stoicism to a certain extent. But it also emphasizes personal responsibility. The madman must have his own madness, as Foucault says. And religion is the thing which helps them seize that self-consciousness, or create that self-consciousness, that awareness that I am responsible for myself and my decisions. And it is interesting, then, that the religious connotations of the beast as a messiah come to the fore thanks to Dennis, and thanks, of course, to Patricia. And I do want to go back to that idea that I mentioned regarding the purposes of all of these altars. Because Patricia and Dennis, and then later Hedwig, who seems to be the key to their supremacy, as it were, are referred to collectively as the Horde. And Horde, speaking myself as a former Catholic, invokes the image of a collection of demons. That is what it appears to me. That's what it evokes, I should say. But they all serve to protect Kevin. Dr. Fletcher says, I know you want to protect Kevin. I know I want that too. But how do they do that? Well, Hedwig represents sort of the childhood he never got, that Kevin never got because of his abuse. He had to abandon his childish life in order to survive, in order to continue. Dennis, as the first alter, represents, as I said, cleanliness that staves off his mother's rage. But also, like many cases of serial killers, but not all of them, the mother's abuse is sort of implied to be a source for him abusing specifically young women. Because we can't forget, Dennis and the Beast, this is all very gendered violence. Patricia can complicate that a little bit, but Patricia is a very sort of calm, upright, orderly sort of matron figure with British accent and all that. Her ladylike conduct is seemingly an antithesis to the loud, abrasive figure of Kevin's actual mother, giving Kevin and the system an actual maternal figure. I will not go into the Oedipal complex for this. I will not go into narcissism for this, because, quite frankly, those are too far disparate from the actual science of the psychiatric practice. So then what does the Beast represent? Well, as I said, it is the animality, the id manifest. There is no holds, no fetters, no chains that can hold the animal freedom, the absolute self-assurance of selfish anarchy justified by a messiah complex. A messiah complex that rationalizes the question of why do I suffer? And expands on it to why does anyone suffer? It is Kevin's wrath towards the world that does not understand or like people with his disability. The Beast is not only that animal freedom, but it is also that, as it were, the messiah that Kevin always needed but never got. Now, I do want to jump briefly to touch on Freud and his concepts of the death and life drives, respectively Thanatos and Eros. All of these alters are seemingly coming from a place of both Eros and Thanatos. For those of you who are not familiar, Freud's conception of the psyche, which includes your consciousness, your unconsciousness, and subconsciousness, which is to say, your awake, your actual active rational mind, as well as your ego, super ego, and id, all is one. That whole construct is driven by Eros, the pleasure principle, which is to say that we want nice things, we want to feel good, we want to be comfortable, we want to experience pleasure in our lives, but it is also paired with the parallel drive of Thanatos, which is, I should clarify, it is not a drive to suicidality, but it is a very, very nuanced drive. It is, I want to distract myself from the fact that I'm going to die, but I'm going to do that by seeking my non-existence. But this is not suicidality. This is seeking detours. I used that word earlier, and I use it for the very particular reason that Freud perceives all of the different choices and environmental factors in our lives as detours, that we manage these detours as a way to deal with our inevitable end, in order to end on our own terms, not seeking out the end, but seeking out an end we have mediated. Now, I do want to say that Casey sort of represents, in the earliest part of their kidnapping, the main character of Casey does sort of represent purely Eros. As an abuse victim, she just wants to pacify. She just wants to avoid pain. He'll hurt us, she says. Barely 15 minutes in, and she has demonstrated that there is something severely dark in her experience that has led her to understand what to do and how to avoid pain. Now, one of the other concepts that I should talk about is the matter of belief. because the beast believes itself to be impenetrable, and thus it is. It is the berserker, I would say, immune to pain, or immune to long-term pain, let's say, powers through pain. But there are phrases that keep on coming up. Dr. Fletcher is a brilliant therapist in the story, and has theorized, supposedly, that human brain chemistry is altered between all of these alter egos, and that maybe they're the next step in understanding the human brain, unlocking the potential. So dissociative identity disorder in this film becomes mystified. The disability becomes romanticized even as sort of an evolutionary superpower. And of course, this ties in with M. Night Shyamalan's larger trilogy, with the previous film Unbreakable and all that. But the members of the system say, believe in us. Dennis Asbury, I believe, says this. It is very particular, I think, to the question of patient's responsibility when you are mentally ill. Anyone can plead insanity to try to lessen their sentence for a crime, because we assume that the mentally ill cannot be responsible for their own choices. That is the logic behind that. But this believe in us is specifically a call to believe in the autonomy and in the drives of that system, of all of the persons within the system that lives in Kevin's body. But in the media, in the common cinematic context in which this film is placed, we don't. We do not trust the mentally ill to govern themselves. We do not trust the mentally ill to make wise decisions. They are infantilized. We perceive them all as roughly on the same page as Hedwig, easily deceived, easily manipulated, incapable of critical thought. But Dr. Fletcher's specific sentiment of, if their minds are shattered, maybe they are more than us, harkens back to the climactic, one of probably the most infamous line of the film. The Beast says this having seen Casey's wounds, her scars from her uncle's abuse. He says, the broken are the more evolved. It is a deep, deep problem in our society that I will get back to very shortly. But in a sense, all of these different personalities feel empowered in their differences, which is fine, and that's fairly normal. But all of this, the entire premise of the film, works on the idea of suffering as unlocking the potential of the brain, as it's said by Dr. Fletcher. It is quite simply mysticized. It is, as I said earlier, the beast represents a supernatural, the strength being inured to pain, the impenetrable skin, all that. It is the berserker made real, the myth of the shape-shifting warrior made real. But this also speaks to a much larger problem in our own contemporary society, and why M. Night Shyamalan's film got such flack, and I would argue, deservedly so. That we in our society, while we hate, it seems, we infantilize the mentally ill, there is something about us that wants to be a part of them, based on this continuous message, particularly in the trope of the suffering artist, the tortured genius. You do not have to suffer to be great, and yet we continuously see stories such as this one, which sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, tell us that you must suffer in order to know love, in order to know greatness, in order to deserve either of these. But, dear listener, I want to remind you that you do not have to suffer. You do not have to know pain in order to know yourself, in order to deserve love, in order to deserve wisdom, in order to earn wisdom. I want to remind you, dear listener, whoever you may be, this is a great lie that we are continuously told, that suffering makes us worthy, makes us beautiful, makes us better. No, suffering is but a part of life. And unfortunately, what this film misses is the very simple message that it is not suffering that makes us better. It is not the broken who are more evolved. No, it is those who choose, with or without suffering, to act out of love. Perhaps that is a little personal. Perhaps that is me projecting onto this film. But nevertheless, I hold true that this is the greatest failing of the film. And so, I will conclude here. In brief review, Foucault's concepts of the evolution of madness, and I am forgetting and purposefully leaving out the antiquity, where madness is still secluded, but mostly in the figure of the leper. But later in the medieval and the Renaissance, it is not quite valorized, and it is still at times secluded, but it is also seen as an act of wisdom, that being mad is not horrific. But in the early modern era, with the Enlightenment, it became unreason, that all unreason, all things labeled as unreason, are deviant. And those deviances must be punished, secluded, hidden, or, in some cases, secluded and then exploited for entertainment. What this film represents, then, is a combination of that mysticism and that spectacle. That the mad in modern society are seen as funny, as entertaining, as jokes and terrors, as beasts doing tricks, who are without help or perhaps don't deserve it. And these are the lies that M. Night Shyamalan perhaps unintentionally spread with this film. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed yourself. I enjoyed creating this. I am Endymion for the Dork at Arms, etc. Thank you.